In the deep and turbulent waters of global geopolitics, perception is often the most deceptive weapon of all. And today, as we enter the critical second quarter of the year 2026, the narrative surrounding the Tehran regime is undergoing a transformation as radical as it is painful. Many armchair analysts and superficial observers have allowed themselves to be seduced by images of drones cutting through foreign skies or by the partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz, hastily assuming that the Islamic Republic has managed to put the American superpower in check. However, the reality hidden behind the propaganda cameras and the official communiques of the Revolutionary Guard tells a story of desperation, financial suffocation, and a structural collapse that threatens to wipe from the map the order established by the Ayatollahs over the course of decades. The current situation is a hall of mirrors where survival is being sold as triumph, but the numbers and the destruction on the ground do not lie about the true state of this nation. Like, subscribe, and share. Let's begin. To truly understand whether anyone is winning on this bloody chessboard, we must step away from the pyrotechnics of missiles and turn our inquisitive gaze toward the cold and ruthless reality of financial balances, because that is where modern wars are won and lost. Iran's economy is not simply in crisis. It is in a terminal freefall that defies any logic of short or medium-term recovery. The International Monetary Fund has issued projections that are, to say the least, terrifying for any nation that intends to sustain a prolonged war effort, estimating a brutal economic contraction of 6.1% for this fiscal year. This collapse is not a market accident or a natural fluctuation, but the direct result of a maximum suffocation strategy executed with surgical precision by the current American administration, which has decided to cut off at the root the financial oxygen supply that keeps the Iranian theocracy alive. The naval blockade implemented by the government of Donald Trump has been, without a doubt, the final blow to Iran's revenue infrastructure, drastically and systematically reducing its oil exports, which have historically represented the country's primary source of foreign currency. Imagine for a second a nation that depends almost exclusively on selling its black gold to feed its population and finance its armies, and that suddenly finds that its ships cannot leave port or are intercepted before reaching their commercial destinations. The result is an economic hemorrhage estimated at the staggering figure of $435 million per day in direct losses and structural damage. It is an amount of money so immense that even the wealthiest nations on the planet would struggle to sustain such a bloodletting for more than a few weeks. Yet Iran has been living through it month after month. This economic suffocation translates into an unprecedented human and social tragedy within Iran's borders, where food inflation has reached three-digit levels, destroying the purchasing power of the middle and lower classes by 90%. People are no longer fighting for ideology or regional victory, but for a piece of bread or a liter of milk that tomorrow will cost twice what it does today. Fuel scarcity, a tragic irony in a country sitting atop one of the world's largest hydrocarbon reserves, has become the daily norm, with long lines at gas stations and electricity rationing that has caused an 18% drop in industrial electricity consumption. Factories grind to a halt, commerce is paralyzed, and the social fabric tears apart as the government desperately tries to project an image of invulnerability abroad, concealing the ever-deepening cracks within its own home. If you still believe Iran is winning, you must ask yourself what kind of victory requires your own people to sink into absolute misery and your industries to become rusted skeletons. Tehran's strategy is not one of conventional conquest or domination, but a macabre bet based on resistance to pain. Iranian leaders are wagering that their tolerance for social suffering is greater than the political patience of the United States and its Western allies. It is the war of the weak against the strong, where the weak does not seek to knock out the giant, but simply to survive while trying to make the giant grow tired of hitting it or frightened by the cost of gasoline in its own cities. However, this wager ignores a crucial factor. Iran's military infrastructure has been decimated by joint precision strikes carried out by American and Israeli forces over recent months. Iran's conventional capabilities have been degraded to a point where they no longer represent a threat of invasion or large-scale battle, but rather a persistent nuisance of asymmetric warfare. The strikes have destroyed key missile and drone production facilities, eliminating the country's ability to regenerate its arsenal at the pace that war demands. What is even more devastating to the regime's morale is that the military leadership has been literally decapitated. The most experienced generals and Quds Force strategists have been eliminated in covert operations and high-precision drone strikes, leaving the Iranian army in a state of confusion and lacking coordinated leadership. The war machine that once seemed a monolithic threat now more closely resembles a group of scattered militias trying to coordinate without a clear head to direct them. To this must be added the most seismic and destabilizing event in Iranian domestic politics in recent decades: the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on the past 28th of February of 2026. The disappearance of the supreme leader has left an immense power vacuum that has not been successfully filled, generating internal uncertainty bordering on panic among political and religious elites. Instead of focusing on the external war, the regime has been forced to turn its guns inward, increasing internal repression to prevent popular protests, fueled by hunger and lack of freedoms, from becoming a revolution that topples the system. The need to spend vital resources on controlling its own population is the definitive proof that the regime is not in a position of strength, but in a state of permanent siege within its own territory. Like, subscribe, and share. The network of power that Iran built over years through its proxies or allied groups in the region is also crumbling under constant military pressure. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, which once served as Tehran's long arm to strike at Israel and Western interests, today face intense calls for total disarmament and have seen their own command structures systematically dismantled. The leaders who once coordinated complex attacks have been eliminated, and the flow of money and weapons from Tehran has been reduced to an insufficient trickle due to the naval blockade and the destruction of supply routes. Without the logistical and financial support of their patron, these groups are losing their strategic relevance and are forced to fight for their own local survival rather than serving the interests of Iran's grand strategy. So why does the idea persist that Iran is winning? The answer lies in its ability to generate global disruption at a relatively low cost. By managing to partially close the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has triggered the greatest energy shock the world has seen in recent decades. This has generated global economic instability that directly affects the pockets of citizens in Europe, Asia, and above all in the United States. Tehran coldly calculates that President Donald Trump will not be able to sustain the naval blockade and economic pressure for long before domestic discontent over high energy prices forces him to back down. In the minds of Iranian leaders, if they manage to hold out long enough to force a negotiation on their own terms, that will be counted as a historic victory, regardless of whether the country lies in ruins in the process. But this is a distorted vision of reality that confuses chaos with control. An actor that sets fire to its own house so that the neighbor is frightened by the smoke is not a winner. It is a suicidal individual seeking to take someone else down with it. Iran is an extremely dangerous actor, precisely because it is cornered and has little to lose, but its real power has been largely castrated. The capacity to launch drones and missiles persists, but it is a diminishing capacity that cannot be sustained against a campaign of continuous degradation. The Iranian victory narrative is, in essence, a narrative of desperate survival that attempts to conceal the fact that its national infrastructure is being turned to ashes under the weight of a war it cannot win in conventional terms. The key facts are irrefutable. An economy that is violently contracting, a population on the verge of famine, a collapsed electrical and fuel infrastructure, and a decapitated military leadership. All of this while facing a succession crisis following the death of their supreme leader. Iran's situation is that of a boxer who has been hit so hard that he can barely stay on his feet, whose only strategy is to cling to the opponent with all his strength to avoid hitting the canvas, hoping that the referee will stop the fight before the final blow. It is not a position of dominance. It is a silent plea for an exit that allows them to save face before history. The illusion that they are winning is just that, a distorted reflection in the oily waters of a disputed strait. Tehran is betting that Western democracy will collapse from inflation before its tyranny falls to the blockade. However, they underestimate the determination of the United States in the face of threats to its energy and national security. Operations like Economic Fury and the deployment of autonomous technology in the Gulf demonstrate Washington's willingness to change the rules to secure the Strait of Hormuz, considering that the cost of gasoline is less than yielding to regional blackmail over global trade. In this geopolitical context, the real question is not whether Iran is winning, but how much longer the Ayatollah's regime can maintain the fiction of its stability before the economic and military reality devours it entirely. Every drone they launch is a piece of technology they cannot easily replace. Every day the naval blockade persists is a day in which they lose millions of dollars they will never recover. The degradation of their regional allies means that Iran is being left alone in a neighborhood that increasingly looks at them with more wariness and less fear. The victory they claim is an empty shell, a propaganda slogan designed for domestic consumption and to deceive the naive abroad who do not see the real figures of destruction. Iran's danger does not lie in its strength, but in its desperation. A weakened regime can take irrational risks to provoke an escalation. Iran seeks to prolong the war not to win, but because the chaos prevents its people from holding it accountable for the misery and waste on foreign wars. Fighting is their way of evading internal social judgment. Looking at this before speaking means recognizing that we are witnessing the end of an era. The architecture of power that Iran built since 1979 is being tested to the point of breaking. The combination of unprecedented economic sanctions, technological superiority on the battlefield, and the loss of spiritual leadership following the death of Khamenei has created a perfect storm that Tehran does not have the capacity to navigate successfully. The next time you hear someone say that Iran has the strategic advantage, remind them that empires are not built on free-falling economies and populations that have no electricity to light their homes. Iran is at its limit. Its military capacity is rapidly degrading, diplomatic and financial isolation is accelerating, and its old blackmail tactics no longer work. What appears to be an ascent is the agony of a system. Iran is militarily weak, economically suffocated, and socially fractured. It remains dangerous like a wounded animal, but the idea that it is winning is pure propaganda. Real victory is prosperity and sustainable power, something Iran has lost. Those who believe in its triumph see a world that no longer exists. The reality for Tehran is far grimmer. Iran, despite the asymmetric warfare, lacks a solid economic base and internal legitimacy. It is sacrificing its future for a failed geopolitical ambition. The degradation campaign by the United States and Israel continues, and the Iranian economy collapses. The outcome will define the balance of power in the Middle East. The true crisis is felt in the scarcity and the elimination of its military threats. Like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.